Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. Sandra Renee Cantu was born on the 8th of March, 2001, a tiny beam of sunshine, the youngest of 4 children in the Cantu family. Her parents, Maria and Daniel, had separated when she was still very little, so for most of her life, Sandra was raised by her mother, surrounded by the warmth of her close-knit family. They all lived together in a modest mobile home park in Tracy, California, her mom, her grandparents, and her siblings all under one roof. It wasn't a big house. In fact, by most standards, it was pretty cramped. But what it lacked in space, it made up for in love. The Cantu family didn't complain. They had each other, and that was enough. And in the middle of all that love was little Sandra, the heart of the household. Sandra was the kind of child who just radiated joy. She was always smiling, always moving, always ready to try something new. She had this adventurous spark that made her instantly likable. It was almost impossible not to smile when you were around her. She had friends everywhere. It didn't matter if you were a kid or an adult, if you lived in the mobile home park, chances are you knew Sandra. She was the type of girl who would stop and chat with anyone. That bubbly, confident energy just made people want to be around her. She loved gardening with her mom and grandparents. She'd get her little hands dirty in the soil, completely in her element. She also adored helping out in the kitchen, stirring, mixing, watching everything closely, soaking it all in. And when she wasn't doing that, she was probably tucked into a corner with her coloring books, lost in a world of bright crayons and careful outlines. But Sandra didn't stay still for long. She was loud in the best way, full of life. She loved singing and dancing, twirling around the living room in bursts of laughter and joy. She was just alive. The kind of kid who lit up every space she walked into without even trying. It was Friday, the 27th of March, 2009. A regular school day had just ended, and 8-year-old Sandra Cantu didn't feel like going straight home. She had something else in mind, something she loved even more than coloring or cooking with her grandparents, playing outside with her friends. When she got back to the trailer park that afternoon, she didn't even bother to settle in. She dropped her school bag at home and ran right back out. That's just how it was for kids in that community. If you wanted to play, you didn't need a phone or a plan. You just knocked on doors until someone came out to join you. Sandra did this almost every single day. It was routine, part of the rhythm of her life. Her mom, Maria, didn't worry. Sandra always made it home in time for dinner, and she always followed the rules. The most important one? Never leave the trailer park. The family trusted the neighborhood. Everyone knew each other. It felt safe. As the evening crept in and the sky started to dim, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sandra was just out playing, like always. Around 7 p.m., Maria finished cooking dinner and, as usual, she wanted her daughter to come home so they could eat together as a family. But this time, Sandra wasn't back yet. At first, Maria wasn't worried. She figured maybe Sandra had lost track of time or was just playing nearby. So she started calling around, phoning all the parents in the trailer park, asking if Sandra was at their place. One by one, they all said no. Not only that, none of them had seen Sandra in hours. The last time anyone remembered seeing her was around 4 p.m., right after she dropped off her bag at home and gone door to door looking for someone to play with. That meant for the last 3 hours, Sandra had seemingly disappeared. Still, Maria tried to stay calm. Maybe Sandra couldn't find anyone to hang out with, so she started playing alone somewhere. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, calling her daughter's name through the open air. Maybe she was tucked behind a bush or playing behind one of the trailers like she sometimes did. Maria began walking around the park, doing slow, anxious laps, calling Sandra's name louder each time. But there was no answer, and no sign of Sandra. She kept searching. Another 20, maybe 30 minutes passed, and Maria's worry was growing by the second. She called out for Sandra again and again, walking through the same corners of the trailer park, hoping, praying that her daughter would just pop out from behind something with that familiar, cheeky smile. But the longer she looked, the more real it became. Sandra wasn't there. Eventually, with fear taking over, Maria rushed back home and called the police. Her little girl, always so reliable, always home for dinner, was now missing. Officers arrived at the Cantu home not long after. Inside, they sat with the family and took down every detail they could. What Sandra looked like, what she was wearing. Maria remembered it all so clearly. Her pink Hello Kitty t-shirt, her black leggings. It was burned into her mind. While some of the officers remained with the family, others walked the trailer park, knocking on doors, asking everyone the same question. Have you seen Sandra? But again, nothing. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. It was as if she had vanished. Then something came up that gave police at least a place to start. Sandra's grandfather had recently installed a security camera at the front of their home just in case of a break-in or vandalism or anything unexpected. He offered up the footage without hesitation. The officers watched the tape closely. There was Sandra coming home just after school. She walked inside, dropped off her bags, and then a moment later, she was out again. It was around 4 p.m. She didn't look upset or rushed. She wasn't acting strangely. In fact, she was skipping. She looked completely happy. That was the last time anyone saw her. From that moment on, Sandra never reappeared on the camera. She never came back home. No signs of struggle, no signs of panic, just a little girl walking into the neighborhood, and then nothing. The footage helped to confirm what she was wearing, but beyond that, it gave them very little to go on. So the officers kept talking with the family. They needed to understand more about Sandra's life, who she spent time with, what her routines were, who might want to harm her. That's when they learned that her parents were separated. And not just separated at the time, they were in the middle of finalizing a divorce, including sorting out the custody of the children. And sadly, it's something investigators have seen before. In cases of child abduction or disappearance, it's not uncommon for the person responsible to be a parent specifically, the one who doesn't have custody. They go and literally take the child in order to spend time with them, or, maybe use the child as a weapon. So that was the police's initial theory, that maybe Sandra's father had taken her. But Sandra's mother, Maria, just didn't believe that for a second. She knew her ex-husband better than anyone else. And in her heart, she was certain that just wasn't him. He hadn't been a big part of Sandra's life for the past few years. They weren't in the middle of any nasty custody battle. There were no heated arguments, no recent drama. They weren't fighting, they weren't even really talking. But still, she just couldn't imagine him doing something like this. It wasn't in his character. Regardless, the police had to follow every lead. So they tracked down Sandra's father and brought him in for questioning. They needed to rule him out completely. And honestly, it didn't take long. He wasn't even in Tracy at the time Sandra went missing. There was no evidence linking him to anything. So, just like that, that theory collapsed. And they were back to square one. No leads. No suspects. Nothing. By now, time was slipping away. The hours were passing, rolling into the next morning, nearly a full day since Sandra had last been seen. Police knew how serious this was. They knew the stats. When a child goes missing, the first 3 hours are absolutely critical. If you don't find them within that window, the chances of bringing them home safely drop to 70%, just 3 hours. Sandra's family hadn't even realized she was missing until around that 3-hour mark. From there, the numbers only got worse. After 12 hours, those chances are cut in half. And after 24 hours, they plummet sometimes as low as 10%. That's what police were facing now. A 10% chance of finding Sandra Cantu alive. But they weren't giving up. They called in the FBI, brought in sniffer dogs. Officers searched on horseback. Helicopters circled overhead. They started blocking off roads, stopping cars, questioning everyone who came near the trailer park. Every single person, every car was a possible clue. At home, the Cantu family did everything they could. They were printing out missing person posters, handing them out, taping them to lampposts, putting them in windows, in shops, anywhere. And they weren't alone. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of people came forward to help. Volunteers who had never even met Sandra. People who didn't know her family. People from all over California. Her face was everywhere. On the news, in newspapers, on every major media outlet. And with that kind of exposure came more help. People started donating money. Businesses, wealthy families, even total strangers, they just wanted to help. The reward for information started small, just $2,000, but it kept growing and growing until eventually it reached $30,000. Then, on the second day of the investigation, police received a tip. A small one, nothing major, but it came from someone who lived right there in the trailer park. This neighbor explained that the reason they hadn't come forward sooner was because, at first, it seemed completely irrelevant, just a minor thing. But the more they thought about it, the more they felt it might be important just in case. They told officers that on the day Sandra went missing, they'd noticed something strange. A suitcase, sitting out on a neighbor's driveway. Nothing unusual at first, maybe someone left it there while packing or cleaning. But then, around 4 p.m., that suitcase disappeared. At the time, the woman just assumed someone had stolen it. She didn't want to bother the police with something so trivial. A missing suitcase? It felt silly with everything else going on. But as she kept thinking about it, it started to feel off. Like maybe that suitcase and Sandra's disappearance weren't just two separate things. Maybe, just maybe, they were connected. Maybe the same person that stole Sandra stole the suitcase for whatever reason. Police kept the suitcase tip in mind. They logged it in the case file just in case it came back around. But truthfully, at this point, it didn't offer much to go on. There was nothing solid. Just a gut feeling from a neighbor which mattered but wasn't enough. So they kept moving. Over the next few days, investigators chased down every possible lead they could find. And that included a few very short-lived suspects. People who were flagged during interviews with Sandra's family, her friends, the neighbors, people who seemed a little off, or who had pasts that raised red flags. One of the first was an ice cream man. He'd been spotted in the trailer park on the very same day Sandra disappeared. But here's the thing, no one really recognized him. He wasn't one of the usual guys who came through the area. He was unfamiliar, and that alone made people uneasy. Neighbors remembered seeing him talking to a group of kids that afternoon. Now, of course, that's kind of what ice cream men do, they talk to kids. But something about him felt off. The people who lived there got a strange vibe. So they told the police, hey, we don't know this guy. He's not usually around. And one day he is here, Sandra goes missing. Police looked into it, but there was nothing that directly connected him to Sandra. No one saw him talking to her. No weird behavior beyond that bad feeling. And after checking him out, the police ruled him out fairly quickly. Then came another man. This one hit much closer to home, someone who actually lived inside the trailer park. An older man. And this time, the tip didn't come from just anyone. It came from Sandra's own family. They told police to look into him because they already knew he was dangerous. He was a registered sex offender, a known pedophile. And more than that, they said he'd already made inappropriate contact with Sandra before. There was one particular incident, Maria remembered, that had haunted her ever since. It happened at the community swimming pool. Sandra, being the bright and chatty girl she was, had struck up a conversation with this older man. Nothing unusual at first, she talked to everyone. But then, someone saw him reach out, brush the hair from Sandra's face, and kiss her on the lips. An old man kissing a child on the lips. At the time, Sandra was about 6 years old. 2 years before she went missing. Police brought him in. They sat him down, confronted him with what they knew, and shockingly, he confessed. He didn't even deny it. He just shrugged and said it was harmless affection. The officers quickly shut that down. They made it clear. That wasn't affection. That was sexual assault against a minor. Then, during the interview, the man admitted something even more disturbing. He told police that he was sexually attracted to children, specifically little girls around the age of 9 or 10. Sandra Cantu was 8. She fit his type exactly. I mean, it's hard to imagine a bigger red flag than that. He basically laid it all out in the open, admitted everything. And still, he had an alibi. It checked out. He wasn't near Sandra when she disappeared. There was no physical evidence linking him to her. Nothing the police could charge him with beyond what he'd already confessed to. They were still watching him, of course, closely, but for now, they had to shift their focus elsewhere. Even though, honestly, they should be watching that guy for the rest of his life. Because, freak. A few days into the investigation, just when the case seemed to be at a painful standstill, police received another tip. And this one, it felt different. A man who worked at the local dump had called the station after noticing something strange, a child's pink Hello Kitty t-shirt tossed in with the trash. Now normally, that kind of thing wouldn't stand out. People throw clothes away all the time. But this man had been following the Sandra Cantu case on the news like so many others. And that pink Hello Kitty shirt, it sounded an awful lot like the one Sandra had been wearing the day she went missing. He couldn't shake the feeling, so he did the right thing. He called the police. Officers rushed to the landfill and collected the t-shirt. They bagged it carefully and brought it back to the station for processing. But before they did anything else, they made the heartbreaking call to Sandra's family. They needed them to come in, to look at it, to tell them, was this Sandra's shirt? The family arrived at the station, their hearts heavy with dread. Maria, holding back tears, looked down at the little t-shirt laid out on the table, but almost immediately, she shook her head. It wasn't Sandra's blank. It was a similar shade of pink, sure, and yes, it had Hello Kitty on it, but it was the wrong design, and more than that, it was the wrong size. Maria knew what her daughter wore. This wasn't it. And in that moment, relief, just a wave of hope came rushing back in. This wasn't Sandra's shirt. Maybe, just maybe, she was still out there somewhere. But even with that hope, the investigation was back where it started, running out of time and out of leads. So the detectives decided to go back to the beginning, to the only solid piece of evidence they had, the CCTV footage. That short clip, the final known images of Sandra Cantu, became their focus once again. This time, they studied it more closely, frame by frame, minute by minute, watching not just where Sandra went, but how she moved. And that's when they saw something they hadn't picked up on before. At the start of the video, Sandra's walking in a clear, direct path diagonally across the frame, straight toward her house. But then, she stops. Just briefly, she turns her head. And she changes direction. She turns down another street. It was subtle blink and you'd miss it. But that sudden switch, of course, raised questions. Why? Why did she change her mind? She had clearly been heading home. But then, in that one moment, something caught her attention. Something made her veer off. Had someone called out to her? Had something or someone pulled her away? Police tracked the direction of her gaze, and it looked like she was glancing toward the home of one of her best friends. That part made sense. Maybe she suddenly remembered she hadn't knocked on her door yet. Maybe she was just thinking, I'll go see if she wants to come play. But what unsettled investigators was this. Sandra had intended to go home. She was on her way there. You could see it in her steps and her direction, and then something right at the last second changed her mind. Another few days passed in the search for Sandra Cantu, and as time dragged on, so did the heavy, unbearable silence. Hopes, they were dwindling. You could feel it in the air, around the trailer park, in the police station, even across the wider community. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the reality was sinking in. The chances of finding Sandra alive were getting smaller by the hour. People were still searching, still showing up. But deep down, many were beginning to wonder if they were fighting a losing battle. In one final effort to keep hope alive, to rally the community, and remind everyone why they were still pushing forward, a candlelit vigil was organized. Something soft, something beautiful, something to hold on to. And everyone came. Sandra's family, of course, her mom, her grandparents, her siblings, her friends from the neighborhood, neighbors from the trailer park, people who barely knew Sandra, but who had followed the story so closely they felt like they did know her. People who just wanted to be close to her family, to stand beside them in support. Even the police were there, and not just a handful, the FBI came too. Many of the officers working this case said they felt a personal connection to it, that looking for Sandra felt like looking for their own child. But there was another reason they came, because if someone had taken Sandra, there was a good chance they might show up. That's not just a theory, it's something that happens. Many criminals, even serial killers, show up at crime scenes, at vigils, at search efforts, sometimes to blend in, to avoid suspicion. Other times, just to watch the pain they caused, to revel in it. So that night, the officers stood quietly among the crowd, candles flickering in their hands, listening as people sang songs, shared stories, cried, laughed. They remembered Sandra, her energy, her kindness, her brightness. For a moment there was warmth, togetherness, love, and then chaos. A woman suddenly burst through the center of the crowd, screaming, wailing, crying uncontrollably. "I found something!" she yelled again and again, her voice breaking with panic. "I found something!" She ran up to the investigators and grabbed one by the arm, begging them to follow her. She was almost incoherent, shaking, sobbing, leading them towards something. No one knew what was happening, but they followed. She led them to the bank of mailboxes near the front of the trailer park, and when she got there, she collapsed to the ground. She pointed to something just beside her, a letter. Just sitting there, she kept repeating herself through broken cries. "It's there! It's there! It's there!" The officers bent down, picked it up, read it. The letter said, "Cantu locked in a stolen suitcase thrown in water on Vachetti Road and Whitehall Road," and it was signed Witness. The letter was immediately collected and bagged as evidence. Back at the station, investigators wasted no time. They brought in experts from multiple fields, handwriting analysts, forensic linguists, even criminologists to examine it. Everyone looked closely at the paper, and they all came to the same conclusion. Something about this letter was off, very off. It wasn't just the content, although that alone was chilling. It was how it was written, the tone, the structure, the spelling. Some of the words were so blatantly misspelled, it almost felt like a joke. Not just simple typos. We're talking about words like on being spelled with two N's. Who in the world thinks on is spelled on? It didn't feel like carelessness. It felt deliberate, forced. And the strange thing was, the entire letter was only 12 words long. 12 words. And somehow it was riddled with spelling mistakes far more than what any average person would naturally make. Investigators were convinced this wasn't accidental. Someone was trying too hard to appear careless. Someone was trying to cover their tracks. Handwriting experts agreed. They said the writing didn't look natural. It looked like it was faked, like the person who wrote it had tried to disguise their real handwriting. But regardless of how weird it was, the content of the letter was terrifying. Whether it was real or not, it made one very specific, very dark claim that Sandra Cantu was dead, that she had been locked in a suitcase, and that her body had been dumped in water on Vachetti Road near Whitehall Road. The next morning, teams of divers were deployed to that area. Every body of water within that zone was searched. It was roughly 2 miles from the trailer park where Sandra had lived close enough to matter. But the search was far from simple. Some of these weren't normal lakes or ponds. Some of them were sewage ponds, runoffs from local farms. These weren't places with clear water or sandy bottoms. It was thick, heavy, sludge-like, and it was nearly impossible for divers to properly navigate. If there was a suitcase in there, and it had been there for a few days, it would have sunk deep, buried beneath thick layers of sewage and waste. The pressure alone would have made it nearly impossible to lift. Still, the teams tried. They worked through the muck. They pushed through the stench. They dug as deep as they could. But they knew this wasn't going to be quick or easy. It would take time, maybe a lot of it. So, while the dive teams pushed on, police back at the station turned their focus to the letter, who wrote it, and how did it end up there. They started by looking at the woman who found it. Her name was Melissa Huckabee. She lived just 2 lots down from the Cantu family, a close neighbor, practically next door. Melissa had a young daughter of her own just 5 years old, a little girl who used to play with Sandra all the time. So Melissa felt close to this case. Very close. She felt really connected to this case. Melissa Huckabee knew Sandra quite well. She told investigators that Sandra's disappearance had really shaken her, and not just her, but her whole family. Melissa wasn't just a neighbor. She worked at the local church as a Sunday school teacher. Her father was the pastor there. And since the day Sandra went missing, their church community had been deeply involved, praying for her, holding space for her, keeping her memory alive in their services. So, when she found that letter, she said it hit her hard. But what alarmed her most wasn't just the content, it was how specific it was. The letter mentioned a stolen suitcase. And Melissa Huckabee just happened to be the very person who had reported a suitcase stolen on the exact same day Sandra went missing. She explained that, at first, she hadn't thought it was anything important, just a missing suitcase from her driveway. But as the hours passed, the coincidence started to feel too big to ignore. So she called it in. And that suitcase, it wasn't a small one. It was big enough to fit a child. As police spoke with her, something began to feel strange. Too many key things in this investigation were somehow revolving around Melissa Huckabee, a woman who, at least on the surface, had no direct connection to Sandra's disappearance. It was her suitcase that went missing. It was her who found the letter. And that same letter even used the phrase stolen suitcase. That part really bothered the investigators. If the letter had truly come from Sandra's killer, why would they use the term stolen suitcase? That was a weird detail for a killer to include. It implied they knew it didn't belong to them, that it had been taken specifically from someone. But how would they know it was stolen? And more importantly, why would they send the letter to Melissa Huckabee, of all people? If this was real, if someone had done something to Sandra, wouldn't they have written directly to Sandra's family? Or left a letter near their home? Why Melissa? Why was everything happening around her? To the police, it all felt a little too convenient. Now they didn't jump to accuse her. At this point, they didn't think she was the killer. But they did start to wonder if Melissa Huckabee just wanted to be involved. They began to suspect she was an attention seeker, someone who was inserting herself into the case, trying to make it about her, someone who might have written the letter herself just to get a reaction, just to feel important. So naturally, they kept talking to her. They wanted to know more about this woman and her relationship with Sandra. So the investigators asked Melissa where she had been on the day Sandra went missing, specifically around 4 p.m., the time Sandra was last seen on CCTV. Melissa said she'd been at the church where she worked as a Sunday school teacher. According to her, she was redecorating her classroom that afternoon alone. The police asked her if there was anything at all she could give them to support that. A text, a call, any digital footprint that would confirm her alibi. And Melissa said yes. She mentioned that while she was at the church, she had made a phone call to someone back at the trailer park to report that her suitcase had been stolen. She told them it happened around that same time. So naturally, investigators pulled her phone records, and she was telling the truth. There was a phone call made from the church, placed around 4 p.m., the exact time Sandra was seen skipping down the street in the CCTV footage. Maybe Melissa had been there, maybe not. But even with the timestamp, the police weren't completely satisfied. Because the thing is, Sandra being seen at 4 p.m. didn't mean that was the exact moment she was taken. It just meant it was the last confirmed sighting. She could have stayed out playing for another hour, maybe even 2. She wasn't reported missing until after 7 p.m. So technically, a lot could have happened after 4. And Melissa still lingered in their minds, not as a suspect necessarily, but definitely as a person of interest. So the police asked her for one more thing. They wanted to seize her car and give it a look just to be thorough. Melissa agreed. They weren't expecting to find anything dramatic, no weapon, no blood, nothing that would blow the case wide open. It was just a standard check. But they did find something. Inside the glove box was a small, ordinary-looking blue sticky note. At first glance, it was just scribbles. Black pen, messy and chaotic, as if someone had violently scratched out whatever had been written, but the scribbles had shape like there had been words underneath. So, the note was sent off to handwriting analysts, experts, people who knew how to reveal what others had tried to hide. They ran their tests, magnification, contrast adjustment, microscopic analysis, all the stuff you usually only see in crime documentaries. And they uncovered what was beneath the ink. 3 words: Bouchetti Road, Whitehall Road, water. The same 3 words, the exact 3 words that had appeared in the mysterious letter Melissa Huckabee had found just days earlier. Bit weird. So now, police decided it was time to search Melissa Huckabee's home. At this point, she was starting to look more suspicious by the minute. Too many connections, too many coincidences. And now, that sticky note. Investigators needed to know more. Inside her home, they searched room by room until eventually, tucked beneath the nightstand beside her bed, they found something. A notebook. Melissa had gone out of her way to hide it, slipping it under the dresser where no one would think to look casually. But police did find it, and as soon as they opened it, something stood out. The paper. It was the exact same kind of paper as the one used in the anonymous letter sent to Melissa. Same thickness, same color, same texture. They flipped through the notebook slowly, carefully, and noticed that one page had been torn out. But that wasn't the only thing. On the very next page, the one that was still attached to the notebook, there were indents. You know when someone presses hard with a pen? Even after you rip out the page, the pressure leaves marks on the next sheet, and when they looked closer, those indents lined up perfectly with several of the words written in the mysterious letter. Same paper, same notebook, same message. At that point, it was no longer a theory. Police now knew that Melissa Huckabee had written that letter. She had sent that letter to herself. But the question was why? Was she the one who had actually harmed Sandra? Was this some bizarre attempt to lead investigators to the body of a child she had murdered, while simultaneously making herself look like the one who discovered the clue? Or was this just a sick cry for attention? That's what police were starting to believe. Because when they looked back at the candlelit vigil, the way she had run through the crowd, screaming, collapsing, wailing uncontrollably, it all felt staged, over the top, almost theatrical. They started to think maybe Melissa didn't actually know anything about where Sandra was. Maybe she had just wanted to be at the center of it all. Maybe she needed the attention. People who knew Melissa said this wasn't new behavior. And just to be clear, having mental illness doesn't mean someone seeks attention. That's not what this is about. But those close to Melissa said she had a history of doing dramatic things for no clear reason. Things that made people stop and stare. Maybe this was just another one of those moments. Still, no matter how convinced the police were that it could all just be attention-seeking, they couldn't be certain. So they kept digging. They called Melissa Huckabee back in for another interview. But before detectives could even ask their first question, Melissa jumped in almost too eagerly. She said she actually had a few suspects of her own that she thought police should look into. The first was an older man who lived at the trailer park. She claimed he had a history of sexually assaulting young girls in the area and that, on some occasions, he even drugged them. Somehow, this had happened more than once. Melissa said she had seen him speaking with Sandra on several occasions. Then, she named 2 more people. This time, it was a father and son. They were jewelers, but the son was an adult, 2 grown men who also lived in the trailer park. And Melissa told police she believed that both of them were pedophiles. She even said they had pictures of children on their phones, possibly even pictures of Sandra Cantu. So police followed up on Melissa Huckabee's claims, They began looking into all three of the men she had named, starting with the older man who allegedly had a history of drugging and assaulting children in the trailer park. But very quickly, he was cleared. There was no recent evidence, no ties to Sandra, nothing that could connect him to her disappearance. Whatever suspicions Melissa had pointed toward him, they didn't hold up under scrutiny. Next, they turned their attention to the father and son, the jewelers, who also lived in the trailer park. Police obtained a warrant to seize their phones, and what they found was unsettling. There were a lot of photos of children, including Sandra Cantu. Now, the images weren't overtly graphic. It wasn't what you would legally call child pornography, but they were suggestive. The kind of photos that, on the surface, might seem innocent to an outsider or to the child herself. One photo showed Sandra sitting on one of the men's laps. To Sandra, that might have felt harmless. Just another adult in the neighborhood. Maybe someone she'd seen before. Maybe someone who smiled at her or gave her candy. But to the police, it was a red flag. Because those men knew what they were doing. They knew it wasn't appropriate to have a child, someone else's child, sitting on their knee like that. And more than that, they took that picture for a reason. So all of the men who had been named as potential suspects, the three Melissa Huckabee had mentioned, plus the older man who'd once kissed Sandra at the pool, were brought in for polygraph tests, lie detector tests. They wanted to see if any of them were hiding something. The man from the pool, the one who had openly admitted to kissing Sandra years earlier, actually passed his polygraph. It wasn't much, but it helped police feel a bit more confident that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The man with a history of drugging children, though, he failed. Still, he had a solid alibi, one that could be confirmed by other people, by records. So, despite the failed test, police didn't feel they had enough to press further. For now, they let it go. But then there were the father and son, the jewelers. They also took the polygraph test, and both of them failed. So, what was going on? 3 of these men had failed lie detector tests related to knowing where Sandra Cantu was. 3. It made police wonder, did they know more than they were saying? Was there some connection between them? Had they somehow worked together? It raised a lot of uncomfortable questions. And just to step back from the story for a second, I want to say something here. Lie detector tests? In my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of experts, they're absolute crap. They're not science, they're not reliable. That's why polygraph results aren't even admissible in court, because they can't be trusted. People can pass them even when they're lying, or fail them while telling the truth. They can be manipulated by anxiety, nerves, stress, things that have nothing to do with guilt. And yet, they're still used, probably just as a tool, a rough idea to guide further questioning. But they're far from concrete. Whether you believe in polygraphs or not, that's your choice. But it's worth knowing. They're a load of crap. At this point, police were starting to think the lie detector results weren't just random noise. What if these people were all linked in some way? Maybe they hadn't acted alone. Maybe this wasn't just one person's doing. The theory began to take shape. Perhaps Melissa Huckabee had been involved, and maybe she had named those other men because she knew they were involved too. Maybe this wasn't some wild guess, but something darker, something real. Because otherwise, how would she have known? Why would she volunteer their names? But before police could dig deeper into that theory, before they had time to explore how all these pieces might connect, the phone rang, and it was the call, the one they had feared since day one. It was the 6th of April, 2009, 11 days since Sandra Cantu had vanished, and a call came in from a worker at a local irrigation pond. They had been draining the water, a routine job they did from time to time, when one of the workers spotted something, a suitcase. Police responded immediately. They rushed to the scene, praying it was nothing, but deep down they knew. The suitcase was black, ordinary looking. Both of the zippers had been tied tightly together with a piece of thin, white string. Officers didn't open it on sight. They didn't want to risk damaging any evidence. If this was what they thought it was, they had to be careful. So instead, they placed the entire suitcase into a body bag and carefully transported it to the forensic medical lab. And the moment the team picked it up, they knew it was heavy, far too heavy to be empty. And then came the smell, the unmistakable gut-wrenching smell of human decomposition, a smell that clung to the air and left no room for hope. At the lab, the suitcase was open, and just like that, everyone's worst fears were confirmed. Inside was the body of Sandra Cantu. She was still clothed. Her small body had been curled into the fetal position, tucked inside like a child's doll. The rate of decomposition had moved fast, so fast that she couldn't immediately be identified by appearance alone. But her clothes, the same ones she was last seen in, told them everything. It was her. Sandra. At first glance, there were no obvious injuries, no stab wounds, no bruises, no visible trauma. It wasn't clear how she had died. There wasn't a single self-defense wound on her arms. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no marks. Her body was sent for an autopsy, and when it was examined, they found only one mark. Just one. A small scratch inside her lip, and no one knew how she had sustained that. The toxicology report finally brought some clarity. Sandra Cantu had been drugged at the time of her death. Tests revealed a significant amount of benzodiazepines in her system, a sedative, a strong one. The levels were high enough that it was likely she was completely unconscious, maybe even fully sedated, when she died. In the coroner's official ruling, Sandra Cantu had died from asphyxiation. She had been strangled using what the report described as a noose made from cloth. But given the drug levels in her system, the working theory was that she hadn't felt it, that she was already unconscious when it happened. She never had a chance to fight back. Now, this next part is incredibly difficult to talk about. If you need to skip ahead, even just 30 seconds, that's completely understandable. Because during the autopsy, examiners also found that Sandra had been sexually assaulted using a foreign object. They were able to determine this based on the specific angle and location of the injuries, and then something else stood out. Sandra's body, when it was discovered inside that suitcase, was fully clothed, which raised a deeply disturbing question. Did the killer assault her and then redress her? Why? That kind of act is rare, unexpectedly. It doesn't follow the typical pattern seen in these cases. Usually, if a victim's clothes are removed during an assault, the killer either discards them at the scene, hides them, or destroys them. But in this case, someone had carefully dressed her again. Not just placing the clothes beside her in the suitcase, but actually put them back on her body. It was quite unusual that they'd fully dressed her instead of just putting the clothes next to her in the suitcase. This discovery that Sandra had been redressed after being assaulted gave psychologists a troubling theory. They believed that whoever did this may have felt remorse, shame, maybe even guilt. Enough, at least, to try and give Sandra a small scrap of dignity before abandoning her body. That kind of behavior, redressing a victim, isn't typical. It's rare. And it often suggests that the killer wasn't a cold, emotionless stranger. It suggests that maybe this person knew Sandra. Maybe they cared. Maybe they hated themselves for what they'd done. And suddenly, all eyes turned back to Melissa Huckabee, because at this point, one thing was already confirmed: she had written that letter. The one that described exactly where Sandra's body would be found. The one that mentioned the stolen suitcase. And the thing is, that information hadn't been released to the public. So how did she know? Police didn't need any more convincing. Melissa had to be involved, whether it was the kidnapping, the killing, or both. There was no way she could know those details and not be part of it. So they went down to her trailer, planning to bring her in for another interview. But she wasn't there. Officers knocked on doors, asking around the trailer park. "Have you seen Melissa? Heard from her?" One of the neighbors eventually spoke up. She was in the hospital. Melissa Huckabee had attempted suicide. She had swallowed razor blades, she survived barely, and was being treated for her injuries at the time. And now, the timing of it all just felt too perfect. Yes, Melissa had a history of mental illness. She had been known to struggle with suicidal ideation before, but the fact that she had attempted suicide right as Sandra's body was discovered, Right after the case turned sharply in her direction, police couldn't ignore that. They thought it was telling. Too telling. But the hospital wouldn't let them speak with her just yet. Melissa's mental state wasn't stable. She was fragile, and doctors advised police to wait until she was strong enough to be interviewed. So, for now, they held off and turned their attention elsewhere. They issued a public appeal asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious near the irrigation pond on the day Sandra went missing. Any person, any vehicle, anything out of place. And someone came forward. A man told police that he had seen something strange. He and his girlfriend had been on their way to dinner when they noticed an SUV parked off the side of the road near the pond with the passenger door wide open. No one was around. It just sat there, open, exposed, curious, and a little concerned. They walked over to see what was going on, and that's when they saw her. A middle-aged woman with dark hair walking up from the ditch by the pond. They called out, asked if she was okay. She waved them off, told them not to worry. "Oh, I just needed to use the bathroom," she said. "I pulled over, just went down there by the pond." She smiled, played it off like nothing. The man gave police a full description of the SUV he had seen that day, and it was an exact match to Melissa Huckabee's SUV. At this point, the evidence against Melissa Huckabee was starting to pile up, so police decided to go back to the trailer park not to question her directly, but to ask the neighbors about her. What kind of person was she, really? What was her reputation like in the community? And what they heard wasn't good. People who lived just doors away from Melissa described her as unstable, unreliable, even dangerous. An unsavory character. And as it turned out, she had a criminal record. A long one. Nothing as serious as murder or kidnapping, not officially, but her history showed a clear pattern. Theft, robbery, fraud. She'd even committed arson once, burning down her own home. It was like she had been escalating over the years slowly, quietly, to something darker. Neighbors also shared some deeply troubling stories about her behavior toward children in the community. Incidents that, in hindsight, felt chilling. But at the time, they'd never been officially reported. There was one case in particular. Melissa had taken a young girl, a child, from the trailer park to a playground one afternoon, but she never told the girl's parents. Just took her, disappeared for hours. Imagine that someone from your street just taking your child without a word. When the parents finally got their daughter back, they knew something was wrong. She was slurring her speech, disoriented, unable to move properly. Terrified, they rushed her to the hospital. And what they learned? She had been drugged. The child had been given benzodiazepines, the exact same drug found in Sandra Cantu's system. That was it. It was the connection police had been dreading, but also, in a way, expecting. Still, as much as they wanted to arrest Melissa Huckabee right then and there, they couldn't. They needed more. Something solid. Something that directly tied her to Sandra's murder. So they shifted focus. Back to the church. Melissa's alibi was that she'd been there redecorating her Sunday school classroom. So police got a search warrant and headed over to see if there was anything unusual. And there was. Inside the room where Melissa taught her Sunday classes, they found a window blind with a white string, the kind you pull to open and close it. But this one had a piece of the string cut off, then tied back together. Immediately, police thought of the suitcase. The zippers had been tied with a short piece of white string just like this one. Then, in the kitchen of the church, they found something else. A rolling pin. It looked ordinary, except for two details. The handle was bent, and there was a red smudge on it. Something that looked an awful lot like blood. They didn't waste any time. They bagged it, labeled it, and sent it to the lab for testing, but results would take days. So in the meantime, police tried to think of what else they could do. What move could they make next? And that's when one officer had an idea. Wiretap her phone. Melissa was still in the hospital, recovering from her suicide attempt. She wouldn't know. She wouldn't be suspicious. And maybe, just maybe, she'd say something that could finally seal this case. So they did it. They bugged her phone, and they waited. It wasn't long before she made a call. And it was a call that caught the attention of police Literally, the very day Melissa Huckabee was discharged from the hospital, she returned to her trailer and picked up the phone. The number she dialed? Sandra Cantu's parents. On the line, Melissa sounded casual, almost friendly. She asked whether Sandra's older sister might like to come over and play with her own 5-year-old daughter. The girls had been close, she said. Maybe spending time together would lift everyone's spirits. But on the other end of that call was something Melissa didn't know. Her phone was tapped. Detectives were listening in real time. And the moment they heard her invite another Cantu child to the house, their blood ran cold. Was she luring in another victim, this time from the very same family? Given how much evidence already pointed toward Melissa and knowing she had little left to lose, police feared she might strike again. They raced to her trailer, lights flashing, heartbeats thundering. They knocked. Melissa opened the door. Officers glanced past her into the living room. No kids in sight. Not her daughter, not Sandra's sister. Relief washed over them. They'd arrived in time. Now they needed a quick reason for showing up, something that wouldn't reveal the wiretap. Thinking fast, the lead officer said, "Melissa, we need you to come down to the station and give a formal statement about the letter you found at the vigil." Melissa agreed. Back at the station, detectives decided there was no point dancing around it anymore. They laid out the evidence. The notebook page torn from her nightstand, the matching paper stock, the indented words, the incriminating sticky note from her glove box. "We know you wrote the letter," they said. "We know what the sticky note really says." Melissa shook her head, tears welling up, denying it all. She claimed the letter wasn't hers, claimed she had no idea what sticky note they were talking about. But detectives had more. They reminded her of the eyewitness, the man who had seen a woman by the irrigation pond next to an SUV matching hers exactly, on the very day Sandra disappeared. The moment they mentioned that sighting, Melissa cracked. Her face crumpled. She began to sob, words tumbling out between gasps. "It was an accident. It was an accident. I didn't mean to kill her. She just died." She cried so hard she could barely speak. The detectives sat silently, letting the confession spill out in fragments while she broke down. They waited until she composed herself and then finally started asking her to give them the story of everything that happened. Melissa Huckabee finally began to talk. She told police that on the day Sandra Cantu went missing, the two girls, her own 5-year-old daughter and Sandra, had been playing hide and seek together. Just an innocent game between kids. Melissa said that she had left a suitcase sitting outside on her driveway. And at some point, according to her, Sandra thought it would be a clever hiding spot. She claimed Sandra unzipped the suitcase, climbed inside by herself, and somehow managed to zip it shut from the inside. Already that part sounded off. But Melissa continued. She said that during the game, she got distracted, lost track of time, forgot they were even playing. She claimed she completely forgot that Sandra was hiding inside that suitcase. So then, still believing the suitcase was empty, Melissa said she picked it up, put it in the trunk of her car, and drove to the church where she was supposed to decorate her Sunday school classroom. She said she spent hours there, organizing things, setting up, cleaning, and then, much later, when she returned to the car, she saw the suitcase again. That's when it hit her. According to Melissa, in that moment, she remembered Sandra was inside. She opened the suitcase. Sandra was no longer breathing. Her skin was pale, lifeless. She was clearly dead. Melissa told police she panicked. She said she tried CPR. She tried waking her up. She said she did everything she could, but it was too late. Sandra had suffocated inside. So, out of fear of what people would think, of what would happen to her, Melissa zipped the suitcase back up, drove out to that irrigation pond, and dumped the body. She told officers she didn't know what else to do, that she wasn't a killer, that she had just made a terrible mistake, and now she just wanted to forget it ever happened. Police sat across from her, listening, and in their minds, all they could think was, this is the biggest load of lies I've ever heard. They didn't need to guess. They had the autopsy report right in front of them. They knew Sandra had been sexually assaulted. They knew she had been strangled to death. Melissa's story, every piece of it fell apart the second it was spoken. First of all, how did Sandra zip herself into a suitcase from the inside? It's not just unlikely, it's physically impossible. Second, why would Melissa even bring that suitcase to the church? She never explained that. If it was supposed to be empty, what reason did she have to take it with her? Third, how could she not notice the weight of it? A suitcase with a child inside is heavy. Anyone lifting it would feel that. Fourth, if she was in the middle of a game of hide and seek with her own daughter, how do you forget about one of the kids? And where was her daughter during all this? Did she bring her to the church too? If she knew where her daughter was, how could she just forget Sandra? Nothing added up. Not even a single part of Melissa's story made sense. But by now, it didn't matter, because the forensics had come back. The piece of white string found in the Sunday school classroom, the one that had been cut from the blinds, was confirmed to be the exact same string used to tie the zippers of the suitcase that held Sandra's body. And the rolling pin, that red smudge on the handle, it was Sandra Cantu's blood. There was no denying it anymore. That rolling pin had been the instrument, the one used to sexually assault her. Even if Melissa tried to argue, even if she tried to claim innocence, it didn't matter because Sandra Cantu had never been to that church. She had never stepped foot inside Melissa's Sunday school classroom. So how could her DNA, her blood, of all things, end up on that rolling pin? So finally, police arrested Melissa Huckabee and formally charged her with the murder of Sandra Cantu. But they weren't done. They wanted this case to be airtight. No room for doubt, no cracks in the story. So they went back over everything, collected every last bit of evidence they could get their hands on. And that included Melissa Huckabee's laptop. They pulled her search history, and what they found made their stomachs turn. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It wasn't a panic. It wasn't a moment of madness. What they saw in her search history painted a very different picture. This was premeditated. She had been researching how to kill a child, maybe not Sandra specifically, but a child for some time. She'd been looking into cases just like this one, obsessively reading the details of one in particular. A young girl who had been murdered by her grandfather, hidden inside a suitcase, and dumped in a pond. Almost identical to what Melissa eventually did to Sandra. Police believe she had drawn inspiration from that case, learned from it, studied it, and then, when the time came, carried it out. That's the version of events that was presented in court based on forensic evidence, autopsy results, and what little could be pieced together from CCTV and witness accounts. They believed this is what happened. That day, Sandra was on her way home, and at some point, Melissa Huckabee called out to her. That's what turned Sandra's head in the CCTV footage. That's what made her change direction. Melissa had called her over. She offered to take Sandra to the church, to her Sunday school classroom, said she could help her decorate. And Sandra, ever trusting, ever eager to be kind and helpful, agreed. She got into Melissa's car. When they arrived at the church, Melissa made her a drink, a simple cup of juice, but it was laced with benzodiazepines. Sandra drank it, and as the drug began to take effect, Melissa waited until the child was sedated, and then she attacked her. Investigators believe that Sandra was unconscious throughout the entire ordeal, and in a case this dark, that's the only shred of comfort, that she didn't feel what happened to her. They believe Melissa killed her, strangled her sometime between 5 o'clock and 5:30 p.m. Then, around 6 p.m., Melissa redressed her, zipped her back inside the suitcase, and drove her body to the irrigation pond. And the most heartbreaking part? Sandra Cantu's mother called the police to report her missing at 7:30 p.m. By the time that call was made, her daughter had already been dead for over 2 hours. 28-year-old Melissa Huckabee was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. But instead of facing a trial, she took a plea deal, a deal that spared her from the death penalty. She pleaded guilty. In return, she received life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Melissa Huckabee has never explained why she did it. She's never given a reason. People have speculated, some think it was her mental illness, some believe it was all for attention, that she craved the spotlight. that she wanted to be the one who found the letter, that she wanted to insert herself into the case at every turn. And every time she's asked why, she just cries. She cries and says, "I don't know why I did it," that she regrets it so much. But for something so premeditated, something she researched, it's hard to believe there wasn't some kind of motive behind it. There's got to be a reason why she did it. And Melissa Huckabee is the only person that knows that reason.